Spencer has led seminars on Islam and jihad for the FBI, the United States Central Command, United States Army Command, and General Staff College, the U.S. Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the Justice Department's Anti-Terrorism Advisory Council, and the U.S. intelligence community. He has discussed jihad, Islam, and the terrorism at workshop sponsored by the U.S. State Department and the German Foreign Ministry. He is a consultant with the Center for Security Policy and the Vice President of the American Freedom Defense Initiative. Please help me welcome the man who is on the front lines exposing the jihadist threat worldwide and in America. Glad to have you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Great to see you all. Some of you have met before, and wonderful to see you again. I know that you've been busy, but I was wondering if you'd heard in the news that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the caliph of the Islamic State, or ISIS, has been killed. Thank you. I wish I could say I had done it, but in any case, the left, as you may have noticed, was enraged by this news. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is, of course, the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the left never hesitates to play that game. And so they hate America. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi hates America. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and now he's gone. However, there was more. There were many people who criticized how the whole thing was handled. And Dana Shell Smith, who was the ambassador to Qatar during the Obama administration, said this gruesome, vivid, and probably exaggerated description of dogs chasing down Baghdadi will endanger our personnel in the region. Now this is worth thinking about for a bit. Not too much, but a little while. This gruesome, vivid, and probably exaggerated description of dogs chasing down Baghdadi. That was what as you may have seen the dog that actually did chase al-Baghdadi down. Trump actually released the photo because people were saying, oh, you're lying, Trump. There were no dogs. And so he said, here's the dog. But Dana Shell Smith, former ambassador to Qatar, is saying that Trump actually endangered our troops in the region by pointing out that al-Baghdadi was chased by dogs. Now, why would this be? This is based on her deep assumption that the only reason why Islamic jihadis are waging war against the United States is because we're so very mean to them. And if we would just be nice, then everything would be all right. Now, you think I'm kidding, but think about that. Why would telling the world that al-Baghdadi, the caliph of ISIS, who nobody supposedly supports, although somehow ISIS gets billions of dollars even now in donations from all over the world, how is it that saying that he was chased by dogs and actually killed by dogs, how does that endanger anybody? Her assumption is that the resentments come in the Islamic world because of the mistreatment meted out to Muslims by the West. That all we have to do is be respectful, and then this problem will iron itself out. Now, you might think that's absurd. I admit to you, I think it's absurd. But she was ambassador to Qatar, and I wasn't. So let's think about it some more. She went on to say, Obama, the great saint who was our last president, Obama actually gave Osama bin Laden a Muslim burial. See, he treated him with respect. And there were reports that al-Baghdadi was given a Muslim burial as well. If they're accurate, which I have no reason to believe that they're not, they stem, no doubt, from the same people with the same perspective in the State Department who made sure that Osama bin Laden got a Muslim burial. But the dogs still bother her. The idea of the Muslim burial being respectful in the first place is contradictory entirely to everything else that the State Department establishment tells us and that you have probably heard on your wonderful campuses. Because, wait a minute, I thought these guys weren't Muslims. I thought that ISIS had nothing to do with terrorism and that only racist Islamophobes thought otherwise. Have you ever heard anything like that? I'll bet more than one of you have, but thanks. As a matter of fact, I was recently invited to speak to a Republican group up in New Hampshire. And I thought, oh, a Republican group, New Hampshire, that's a home crowd. So I got on the flight, I went out to New Hampshire, and the Republicans were deeply split because the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a leftist smear organization, says I'm a bad guy. And they say that I purvey Islamophobia. Now, what do I actually do? I point out that jihad terror has roots in Islamic texts and that Muslims act on those Islamic texts. If that's hateful and Islamophobic, well then everybody ought to be. Because otherwise you were saying, well, we cannot and must not look at the ideological derivations of Islamic terrorism and do anything to combat it. And that's really where we are today in the public policy to a great degree and in the public discourse as well. Because, as we all know, ISIS, Caliph al-Baghdadi, and Osama bin Laden, they twisted and hijacked the beautiful religion of peace to create spurious justifications for terrorism that the vast majority of Muslims around the world reject and that have nothing to do with true Islam. And yet when they're killed, they get Muslim burials. Doesn't make any sense. But it also points us to Islamic doctrine in order to try to understand why Dana Shell Smith is so far wrong. Because obviously somebody in the State Department thinks that ISIS and Al-Qaeda have everything to do with Islam, or they wouldn't have given these guys Muslim rights at their burials. This is the Quran. You may have read it. It's the Islamic holy book. This is a moderate one. I got it in Britain. I was over there about 10 years ago, and I went to the Finsbury Park Mosque, which is in London, and it was the headquarters of a terrorist, a man named Abu Hamza al-Masri, who was the imam there, and he was actually at the same time setting up an Al-Qaeda training camp in Oregon. Anybody here from Oregon? Why am I not surprised? And he is now in prison for trying to set up this Al-Qaeda training camp in Oregon. But I went into that mosque. I mean, I was just doing the tourist thing, right? If you've ever been to London, you know, you want to go to the local mosques. And I walked in, I said, I hear you had a little bit of trouble here a few years ago. And the very nice young man there said, yes, we had a bit of trouble here. There were some extremists here, but now we're all moderate. And he really wanted me to convert to Islam. He weighed me down with books, none of them that I'd written. And one of them was this wonderful Quran. Now, what's really wonderful about this Quran is that it's not just the text, but it carries commentary from Sayyid Abu Ala Maududi, who was a Pakistani Muslim scholar, died in 1979. He was the founder of Jamaat-e-Islami, which is still the largest, most influential Islamist party in Pakistan. They want a government based on Islamic law there, which they pretty much have already, but they want even more of it. And he is very influential. If you go to your local Islamic bookstore, next time you're there, then ask them if they have any writings by Maududi. And I guarantee you they will say, oh yes, and hand you a stack as big as this guy was handing me. And so his commentary, in other words, is mainstream. It's not extremist, it's not unusual, it's not obscure. This guy is very famous and influential all around the world, including among Muslims in the United States. And anyway, there's a verse that I wanted to, if you'd open your Qur'ans to chapter 9. You didn't bring it? I never leave home without mine. Anyway, chapter 9, verse 29. Fight those who do not believe in Allah or the last day, and do not forbid what he has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book, that's you, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. The people of the book are Jews and Christians primarily, also Zoroastrians, if any of you are Zoroastrians, and a few others. And the command there is to wage war against them until they pay the jizya, which is a tax, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Now, I'm not asking you, if you go back to your campus and go to your local Islamophobia professor, that professor, he, she, or it, will tell you that I'm taking the verse out of context and I'm a racist, bigoted, hate-mongering Islamophobe. But that's what the verse says, and let's go to Maududi for the commentary and see how Islamophobic he is. The purpose for which the Muslims are required to fight, required, he said, required to fight, there's no option here, is not, as one might think, to compel the unbelievers into embracing Islam. Well, that's reassuring. But what is it for? Rather, he goes on, its purpose is to put an end to the suzerainty. You all are in college. You know what suzerainty is, right? No. The rule, the hegemony, the political overlordship of unbelievers. Its purpose is to put an end to the suzerainty of unbelievers so that the latter are unable to rule over people. That means the purpose for which the Muslims are fighting is to make sure there are no non-Muslim governments or governments not ruled by Islamic law. And that is why the Quran commands them to fight. Now, I started by telling you about Dana Shell Smith and how she was saying that our troops will be endangered because the president said that al-Baghdadi was chased by dogs. If that were true, then it would also be true that they would not fight us unless we disrespected them. That maybe we would open the Quran and say, and find that it says, fight the unbelievers who are mean to you and say that you've been chased by dogs. Doesn't say that. As a matter of fact, it says, kill them wherever you find them. That's chapter 2, verse 191, if you're following along. Chapter 4, verse 89. It's also chapter 9, verse 5. Kill who? Chapter 9, verse 5 says, kill the polytheists wherever you find them. And you might think, oh, well, that lets me off the hook because I'm a monotheist. Well, that's very nice, but the reality is that the Quran thinks you're a polytheist. Chapter 9, verse 30 says that the Jews say Ezra is the Son of God, and the Christians say Christ is the Son of God. There's nary a Jew ever in human history or today who says Ezra is the Son of God, but the Quran says it, so that's it. Jesus is the Son of God, that's basic Christianity, and so in both cases it says that that is idolatry, and that these people are under the curse of Allah for saying this. So yes, the kill the idolaters, the polytheists, wherever you find them, it does apply to you. And you could say, oh, no, I'm an atheist. In the Islamic worldview, held by all the different sects and schools of jurisprudence of Islam, then you are what your culture is. So you might say you're an atheist, but people would say, no, you're a Christian because you're an American, and Americans are Christians. Or you may be a Zionist, which is even worse because the Jews are the worst enemies of the Muslims. Chapter 5, verse 82 of the Quran. Now, in all these verses that I'm telling you, notice that there is no caveat. There is no distinction made. The first one I quoted to you, 929, says, fight those who do not believe in Allah or the last day, even if they are of the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Paying that tax and feeling yourself subdued is a very major thing. Throughout Islamic history, you will see how this became the basis of an institutionalized system of discrimination and harassment, whereby the purpose, the object of the whole thing was to make non-Muslims feel so miserable and live such miserable lives, such wretched lives, that they would convert to Islam to get away from it. They, in the first place, had to pay the special tax, the jizya, that the non-Muslims didn't have to pay. They had to get off the sidewalk if a Muslim was coming and let them pass, as an acknowledgement of being inferior, like in the old Jim Crow South. The worst features of the old Jim Crow South, in fact, are not taken in terms of people knowing historically, but are strongly related to, in terms of how they were intended to humiliate a people, to the Islamic rules for the subjugated people of the book. They couldn't build new houses of worship or repair old ones, so that the community was in a perpetual state of decline. They couldn't build houses or other buildings higher than the houses of other people, of the Muslims, because the Muslim houses and the Muslim mosques always had to be higher than those of the Christians and Jews, the houses of worship of the Christians and Jews and their homes, to show the superiority of Islam. There are thousands, literally thousands, maybe tens of thousands of mosques in India that are built on the ruins of Hindu temples as a sign of the victory of Islam over Hinduism and its superiority over Hinduism. There is on the Temple Mount, the most sacred site in Judaism, there is not one, but there are two mosques, the Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock, to show the superiority, the victory of Islam over Judaism, its superiority over Judaism, and its victory. The Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, Istanbul, was for 1,000 years the grandest church in Christendom. If I ask you, what's the grandest church building, the really most remarkable church building in the entire Christian world, many people would probably say St. Peter's in Rome in the Vatican. But for 1,000 years, it was the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, which on May 29th, 1453, was converted into a mosque after the conquest of Constantinople. This was to show the victory of Islam over Christianity and its superiority. Now, all these things happened because the people who were being attacked were Christians and Jews and Hindus. That is the only reason why it happened. The reason why that is the only reason why it happened is because that's the imperative in the Quran and from the example of Muhammad. The Quran also says in chapter 8, verse 39, you can look it up, fight them until religion is all for Allah. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody converts, but fight them until religion is all for Allah means that those who worship Allah have the hegemony over the others. And that's a political thing. As Maududi points out in the passage I read to you, it's a political fight in order to establish a particular political system which is based on Islamic law and is predicated on the idea that non-Muslims have no right to rule anywhere in the world. So, when Dana Shell Smith says this gruesome, vivid, and probably exaggerated description of dogs chasing down Baghdadi will endanger our personnel in the region, in the first place, she shows she doesn't have a clue. She doesn't have the slightest idea of what the people are that we're facing. That is, what they think, what they want, what they're afraid of, what they hate. All these things you got to know. Why do you have to know them? The oldest adage of war comes from Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Very old book, a couple thousand years old or older, as I recall. And it says, know your enemy. If you do not know your enemy and your enemy knows you, you will lose. And it's very simple. If you don't know your enemy, then you cannot know what your enemy is thinking in terms of what he might do next or why he might do it, and therefore you will not be able to figure out how to counter what the enemy is doing. Now, I've got some bad news for you after all this, after all this sunny and optimistic stuff. Now I get to the bad news. This has been the official policy of the U.S. government since 2011, to officially deny the nature of the enemy. And so it's no wonder that Dana Shell Smith doesn't have a clue. She, after all, is just a minor functionary. But she's representative of an idea that has much greater provenance. Now, what do I mean? I'll tell you what I mean. When I was introduced here earlier, just a few minutes ago, you were told that I had consulted with the FBI and the State Department and various military organizations and so on. And it's true. I used to go into FBI offices fairly often and teach them about the Quran and about Muhammad so that they could know the enemy. I would take them through the basics of the Quran in terms of what Muslims believe, because contrary to what your Islamophobia professor tells you, the reality is that the Islamic terrorists believe they're Muslims. And even our people, as I pointed out to you, know that they're Muslims, even though so many officials deny it, as is clear from giving them Muslim burials and all that. And I would teach them about Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, because these things are very important to the terrorists. If you read ISIS communiques or Al-Qaeda communiques, you will see that from first to last, from beginning to end, without exception, without pause, and without anything else being brought in, they speak about Islam. They speak about the Quran, they speak about Muhammad, and they explain what they are doing again and again and again in terms of Islam and Islam's beliefs and goals and priorities. So if you don't know that, you have no idea what they're all about. So what happened was, I used to teach these things, very basic Islam stuff, to military personnel, to the FBI, to the CIA a couple times. And yes, those guys were more clueless than everybody else. But anyway, the Obama administration in 2011 started to get protests. And in fall of 2011, they actually received a letter that was written by a woman named Farhana Khaira of a group called Muslim Advocates, a lawyers group. You remember what Shakespeare said about lawyers, but anyway. No, it's a joke, people. It's a joke. Anyway, if you don't know what Shakespeare said about lawyers, look it up and then remember it's a joke. But anyway, and 57 other organizations that were allied with this lawyers group. They wrote to John Brennan, who was then in the Department of Homeland Security, of course later became the head of the CIA, and is now one of the key figures in the coup to remove the elected president. And they demanded that he remove me by name. I mean, it was kind of flattering in a sense. That he removed me as a trainer. Now, in saying this, mind you, they didn't say, oh, he says all these things that are wrong. They didn't say that at all. They just said, he is saying these things that are Islamophobic. I'll tell you something about that word, Islamophobia. In the 1990s, there's a group, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which is tied to the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is dedicated in its own words, according to a captured internal document, to eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house. And they invented this word Islamophobia. You're young now and you've grown up with it, but ask your parents if they ever heard it, ever. No, it wasn't invented yet. And the word was invented in order to conflate, to put together two things that really have nothing to do with one another. One is vigilante attacks on innocent Muslims, which is, of course, never justified, and all those people should be prosecuted, whoever do those things. And second, honest analysis of the nature of the jihad threat. And the idea was to inhibit the honest analysis of the nature of the jihad threat by smearing it as hateful and racist and bigoted. And it worked great. They demanded I be fired. I was fired. Now, the point is not really about me, because every last mention of Islam and jihad in connection to counterterror training was then removed from U.S. government materials. So if you were to join the FBI tomorrow, which I don't recommend, then they will train you, and you say, I want to go into counterterrorism. They'll train you about white supremacists. They will train you about constitutionalists. They will train you about all sorts of people who they think are terror threats, but they will not tell you the slightest word about Islamic Jihad, because the U.S. government has been committed ever since then to denying that Islam has anything to do with terrorism. And so we get these false analyses. And the problem with false analyses is that they lead to bad policy. It's not just talk, but talk leads to action, and the action is wrong. Dana Shell Smith, once again, she said, the gruesome, vivid, and probably exaggerated description of dogs chasing down Baghdadi will endanger our personnel in the region. So what if she were in charge? And there are plenty like her who are still there. If she were in charge, then we wouldn't have sent dogs on Baghdadi. He may be alive today, but we wouldn't have endangered our personnel in the region, right? Because we don't want to provoke the poor dears by making them angry. Dogs are unclean in Islam. Muhammad ordered the killing of dogs, and so to set dogs upon Baghdadi was a particular humiliation. But of course she doesn't know that because she doesn't know the first foggiest thing about Islam, because she knows that to study it would be Islamophobic in connection with terrorism. So if this point of view is carried out to its logical conclusion, then what you end up with is a cowed and scared and intimidated U.S. military kowtowing before Islamic terrorists and afraid to do anything to offend them for fear things will get worse for us. In other words, what she's saying is, when you are confronted with a bully, give in to the bully. Give the bully whatever he wants. Do not, above all, fight the bully. Now, I know nowadays there's bullying classes and stuff. It's a very big deal. When I was a kid, way before your parents were born, I was in like 5th grade, and people would say, and I would come home and say, there's a bully, he's bothering me. And so my dad would say, well, did you fight him? No. Well, then you can only expect that he's going to keep going. See, the genius of what we did with Baghdadi was we showed them that we're not afraid of them and that we are going to fight. And yes. And the dominant view represented by people like Dana Shell Smith is that we must not do that we must sit in fear and submit, which is, of course, just exactly what the goal of the Islamic Jihad is, to get us to submit. And so she's playing entirely into their hands. When you're talking about Islamic jihadis, you're talking about people who only understand strength and weakness. They only operate on the basis of intimidation or outright violence. That's all they do. And so if you allow the intimidator to go unchallenged, or give him what he wants, or show him that you're afraid, you know what you're going to get? More intimidation. If you stand up to him and give it back, then the intimidation might stop. I will give you one more example. You remember a few years back, the president moved the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. Now, yes. This was a very big deal. This is actually one of the most important things to have happened in the last 50 years, maybe longer than that. Now, you might find that strange, you know. Why is what happened in Israel important for the United States and the most important thing that's happened in decades? Because the president, for the first time in living memory, was not allowing the United States to be cowed and intimidated. This is very important. In the 1990s, the U.S. Congress passed a bill recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and saying that the U.S. would move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in order to recognize that fact. However, the president could postpone this if he thought that the time wasn't right for it. And President Clinton, he immediately postponed it. Now, why did he do that? Because he was told that if he did it, there would be terrorism, that there would be riots, the Palestinians would kill innocent people, and therefore, to keep the lid on the situation, we had to not move it. Now, that makes sense, right? Except what it really is giving in to the bully again. What you're saying is that the terrorists rule U.S. foreign policy. What you're saying is, if you say you're going to kill people because of what we do, then we won't do it, so you win. And so what are they going to do? They're going to kill more people so that we'll do more of what they want. That's how it's worked since 5th grade. You should have known, but they don't talk about this kind of thing anymore. And not only Bill Clinton, it wasn't just Bill. It was George W. Bush. It was George W. Bush. He did it too. And Obama, I can't do Obama. I'd get arrested. But you see what I mean? They postponed it when it came up every year. They wouldn't do it. They were saying, no, the terrorists run foreign policy for the United States of America, and they tell us what we can do and what we can't do, and they told us we can't do this, and so by golly, we can't do it. And Donald Trump was the first one to say no. The United States sets its foreign policy based on the interests of the United States. And we are not going to be threatened. We're not going to be intimidated. You will do what you're going to do, and we will react accordingly as appropriate, but you are not going to dictate to us what we can and cannot do. And people even said, oh, it doesn't really matter because it's so full of red tape. It's such a complicated situation. It's so very difficult. It'll take him 9 years anyway to move the embassy, and he'll be long gone by then. And, of course, the embassy was there within like 6 months. It's really remarkable what the president has done in this regard. But the biggest and most important aspect of it was that he did not cower to intimidation. And there are still many, many people in the foreign policy establishment who say that's what's wrong. That's why he's so dangerous. That's why we have to impeach and remove him. Because he doesn't play by the rules. And he is setting the United States on the pathway to destruction or to conflicts all over the world or whatever. But that notion is predicated on the idea that if we just give in and give the terrorists what they want, then everything will be okay. Or if we behave respectfully toward the terrorists, then maybe they won't hurt us as much. I mean, the other crazy thing about Dana Shell Smith's statement was, it's not like they weren't fighting us already. I wrote a book a few years back. You could find it at Amazon. The Complete Infidel's Guide to ISIS, in which I show that ISIS called for the killing of American civilians back in 2014, and repeatedly after that. It's not as if they're saying, oh, we loved Americans, except now because they killed this guy, with dogs, we're really mad. So ultimately, and in conclusion, what we're dealing with is reality versus fantasy. There have been various fantasies and fictions and fallacies that have ruled U.S. foreign policy for decades. They have deformed our response to various problems. The embassy in Jerusalem is just one example of many. And President Trump is doing something different. And that is why they hate him so much. If the president were a Republican like Mitt Romney or John McCain, who was essentially a Democrat, who called himself a Republican, I believe it was Lenin, I'm not sure, maybe one of you will know, who said, the best opposition is the one you control yourself. And you got to wonder if these guys are just Democrats that were sent into the Republican Party. I'm not saying there was a big conspiracy. You know, they were probably just willing to play along because it's so much easier. You get all the perks, nobody's calling you names, you have all the preferments, everything's great. And so I can see why they would want to do it. But the president represents something that we haven't had in America for a long time, and that's a real opposition to the dominant establishment. So in conclusion, I commend you all for being here. And if you want to know more about the move to Jerusalem and other aspects of that, there's a book, The Palestinian Delusion, that will be out. It's not actually out yet, but this is a hologram. But it'll be out December 3rd and is also available at any self-respecting bookstore. And above all, don't let yourselves be intimidated. You're going to face incredible pressure on campus, and you doubtless already have or you wouldn't be here. You're going to face abuse of kinds that you didn't even know existed if you stand for the truth. But that's the great weapon you have on your side. That is, what you're saying is true, what you're saying is right. So have some courage, and we will see this thing through. This is more the fantasy I was talking about, see? The UN is just insane and ought to be expelled from New York and completely defunded. But the short answer to why it is this way is this. The UN, of course, was created in order to try to forestall future conflicts and create world peace in the wake of World War II. But immediately it became controlled by various blocs, various groupings of countries that would manipulate votes and essentially were able to get what they wanted. The biggest of these was the Soviet bloc, which of course fell and dissolved in the 1990s. And in the wake of that, the largest voting bloc in the United Nations has been the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation is an association of 57 Muslim governments, 56 nations, and the Palestinian Authority. And the first priority in Islam is based on chapter 2, verse 191 of the Quran. Drive them out from where they drove you out. That is the first priority regarding Israel. Drive them out from where they drove you out. Now, Israel, as you see actually in the Palestinian Delusion, when you read that, you'll see Israel did not actually drive out the Palestinians, but that is the historical myth in that regard. And so the Quranic imperative, what's believed to be a command from Allah, is that they have to drive out the Israelis and destroy Israel. And so that's the first priority of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And because it's the very existence of Israel is an affront to Islam. And so they are essentially in control of the United Nations. And so real human rights abusers, like Mauritania, was it, just named to the UN Human Rights Council, and they issue vastly more condemnations of Israel than of any other state, which only shows that the UN is really just a tool of the OIC at this point, and that's why we should defund it, because the OIC is never going to be our friend. The Quran says the Jews and the Christians will never be satisfied with you until you accept their religion. And that's a little bit of projection, because actually what it is that Islamic hardliners will never be happy with us unless we accept their religion or toe the line. And so we shouldn't be abetting and aiding that perspective by giving them billions of dollars and letting them have the appearance of being some sort of a genuine international organization right in New York City. It was the day after 9/11, all the planes were grounded all over the country, with the exception of planes that George W. Bush gave permission to fly Saudi nationals out of the country, including members of the bin Laden family. Now, why did that happen? Well, this has obviously never been officially explained. We know that there were 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report that were redacted that didn't see the light of day until they were released under heavy pressure from Freedom of Information Acts and people who were invoking the Freedom of Information Act, that is, in 2016. And even then, they were only partially released. And they detail extensive involvement of high-level people in the Saudi government with the 9/11 attacks. And of course, after that, we saw George W. Bush holding hands with King Abdullah, walking around as if they're close buddies, in close consultation with Prince Bandar, who was a very influential and important figure in the Saudi government at the time. So it seems as if the Saudis were exercising undue influence in the U.S. government that was probably motivated by concerns over the price of oil and might have had to do with connections in the oil industry for the Bushes. But this is exactly the kind of thing that needs to be confronted. And it's noteworthy that President Trump is doing such a great job, but he has not confronted the Saudi connections and the nefarious Saudi influence in the United States as of yet, at least not directly. However, he has so opened up the energy sources and achieved energy independence for the United States to such a tremendous degree that we are far less dependent than we were just a couple of years ago on Saudi oil, which is an indirect way of breaking their influence over the United States. But I think when the histories of this time, the 21st century, are written, they're going to, if they're written in an honest manner, there will be some very serious things revealed and surprising things to many about Saudi involvement in the United States as well as Iranian.
Thank you for being here. My name is Adam Natin. I'm from Franciscan University of Steubenville. Before he died, philosopher Rene Girard actually did a lot of work on Islam, and he essentially posited that Islam had been in a mimic rivalry with Christianity since its inception. And I'm wondering if, when we talk about these kinds of things, people should be allowed to have like a real theological understanding and an eschatological understanding of this collision course. And how would people be able to do that in a postmodern secular academy?
Well, there is a great deal to be explored in this regard. I completely agree with that. So the second part of your question first is, how can it be done? Well, the hegemony of the left on campus would have to be broken, and that's your job. And once you deal with that, fix that and then get back to me. In any case, there are some very startling things when you start to compare Islamic theology and Christian theology, and particularly eschatology. Eschatology, for those who may not know, is the study of the end times and what happens at the end of the world. And in the Christian scheme of things, there is the second coming of Christ, of course, and the consummation of all things, and everything is tied up, and evil is defeated, and everything's great. In the Islamic scheme of things, Jesus actually comes back as well. But it's the Islamic Jesus who will break the cross, that is, destroy Christianity, kill the pigs, which is a symbol of the Christians not keeping the Islamic food laws, and abolish the jizya, the tax the Christians pay. So all the Christians will either be converted to Islam or killed. Now, from that, you can go through the biblical stories about the end of the world and the stories in the Islamic tradition about the end of the world, and they're kind of inversions of one another. That you have, on the one hand, the one who was crucified and rose from the dead coming back, and on the other hand, you have the one who is coming back who say wrongly was crucified and rose from the dead, and who's breaking the crosses as a great insult to the majesty of God. Even worse, Muhammad in a hadith is a report about Muhammad's words and deeds. He says that there will be nobody more odious on the day of judgment than the one who says, I am the King of Kings. So it's complete opposite, really, of what Christianity is all about, which says Jesus is the King of Kings. And that doesn't seem to have been any accident, even from a historical standpoint. Even if you say stripping all supernatural or spiritual aspects out of this, even if you just approach it purely historically, it appears that Islam was constructed by people who wanted to have it be an eternal opponent of Christianity and particularly also of Judaism, which doesn't enter so much into the eschatological aspects, but as I said to you during the talk, the Jews are the worst enemies of the Muslims. That's chapter 5, verse 82 of the Quran. And one end time statement about the Jews actually is Muhammad says, the end times will not come until Muslims kill Jews. So you can bring on the end times by killing Jews. The end times will not come until Muslims kill Jews, and the Jews hide behind trees, and the trees say, oh, Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him. So all of this is very clearly designed to be a rebuke and a rejection to Judaism and Christianity and an endless declaration of war against them. And that certainly is something that everybody in the U.S. government should be aware of in great detail, and nobody is. Thanks.